So I'm here at the Filmfest Hamburg and with me is Martin Bright. So Martin, in 2003 you were working for The Observer, and when Katharine Gun contacted you regarding information on the war on Iraq, how do you recall that time?
The time was incredibly intense. We knew that the drums of war were beating, and we were very, very focused on Iraq as a newspaper. It had become a major point of contention within our own newspaper. So when this email arrived, and it looked like it showed that the government was saying one thing and doing another thing, we realised it was a very important story. But of course she didn't bring it to me. It just arrived as a piece of paper with some words written on it. I didn't meet Katharine Gunn until much, much later.
Okay. In a drama, sometimes the truth has to be stretched to make it more exciting, more suspenseful. But how truthful is the film, in your opinion?
Yes, I mean, you talk about the truth being stretched. In fact, in this film, it was probably the other way around, that some things were shortened to make it fit into the hour and 30 minutes of a Hollywood feature film. But the amazing thing about this movie, and the way that Gavin Hood, the director, approached it, is that he was insistent on everything being as close to the truth as possible. So he spent hours interviewing me and Katharine and other protagonists in the film. And when I say hours, days, talking to us, because he wanted this to be absolutely the truth as far as possible. I mean, clearly Matt Smith is not me, Keira Knightley is not Katharine, so there's a level of fictionalisation that you have to have with the movie. But as far as possible, the key events of the movie are exactly how it happened.
That's good to hear. As you just said, in the film you've been portrayed by Matt Smith. Are you in peace with his performance?
I'm completely cool with his performance. How can I possibly complain about being played by such a fine actor? He's not like me, and it's not a kind of impersonation of me. He brings his own personality to the part, which is entirely proper. And I don't think Matt Smith, the person, would naturally be the kind of down and dirty, sneaky reporter that I was. He's much more of a classic hero. But what he does bring, I think, is a real intensity to the part. He captures the pressure that I was under during that period. And I think, generally speaking, the newsroom scenes in the movie are fantastically real, and the performances are amazing.
You just mentioned your involvement in the film, like he interviewed you, but have you been contributed to the film in any other extent? Like during the shoot, for example?
Yes. I mean, again, thanks to the generosity of the filmmakers, I was able to be quite closely involved. Clearly, it's their creation, and when you get involved in something like this, you do have to trust that your life is being told by other people. You have to allow them their creativity. But at the same time, they were very keen to have me involved in every stage of the movie. So yes, during the newsroom scenes, I was there every day. I was advising them on the accuracy, making sure that it was as close as possible to the way that the Observer operated at the time. And indeed, I also have a small cameo role in the film.
Oh, really?
Yes. I have a line.
Now I have to watch it again.
Reporter number one, yes.
Yeah. So if you now look back on to the time when it all happened, would you do it all over again?
Yes, I think I would, without question. Could I have done it differently? Should we have acted more quickly? If we'd have managed to verify this email, a little bit more quickly? Would have things turned out differently? Maybe. But it's not the job of a journalist to change history. It's the job of a journalist to record what's going on, to provide the first draft of history. So for me, this was about telling a great story. It was about taking what we were being told by government, investigating it, and being given the privilege of a leaked document about what was really going on, and trying to inform the public about the reality. What I do feel is that the story is not over. So there are still loose ends. There are still frustrating elements to the story that we still don't know. We don't know who authorised the operation in the United States. We don't know who authorised the operation in the UK. We don't know why the UK judicial system pursued Katharine in the way it did. So there are still plenty of things for journalists to look into.
So that was maybe the reason why you published numerous follow-up articles on that.
Yes, I mean, I continue to be fascinated by this period of history. I continue to believe that this was a story of great significance. I mean, it's just one document that was published. It was just one tiny moment in the history of this war. But I was always surprised that this incident didn't play more of a part in the inquiries we had in our country and in the United States into the conduct of the war. So my hope is that with the release of this film, perhaps the power of cinema will mean that we will revisit some of the incidents in official secrets and be able to pursue some of those stories further.
I hope so too. In your career as a journalist, have you had other stories that significant like this one?
I've never had another story made into a movie, so in terms of
Not
significance, not yet. Yeah, that's true. You never know which of your stories are going to really take off, and you have to realise that in the week that I was reporting on this story, I was doing maybe 4 or 5 other stories, pursuing other stories and writing other stories. There was another story on the front page of The Observer that day about universities, for instance, that I was writing. So as a jobbing journalist, as a hack, you are writing lots and lots of stories. But I think I knew in my gut from the moment I saw the email that this was likely to be a defining story for me. If we could prove it, I knew that it was going to be one of the stories of my career. And even before the movie was made, if I'd been asked what was the best story I ever broke, I think it would be this one.
And obviously you didn't prevent the war in the end.
That much we know, yes.
Yeah. You sometimes think about it, what would happen if you did?
I don't think it's the job of journalists to prevent wars, right? I mean, we're there to report on events. I think what I do regret is that we didn't do more to encourage other journalists to follow up the story. There's only so much one newspaper can do. There's only so much that one journalist can do. And one of the stories of the film, of course, is that it was a collaborative operation. I worked with Peter Beaumont, who's played by Matthew Good in the film, and Ed Vulliamy. And I always think it's important to work on a collaborative basis. I just wish that network had gone further. I wish the American networks had come on board. I wish we'd been able to work with the Chileans and the Pakistanis and all the other nations that were being spied on. So if I have any regret, it's that.
These days, with presidents calling the media fake news, and people just seem to forget how important the role of the media is. What do you think is the reason for that, and how can we, or most importantly, how can we stop it?
We see in Official Secrets one of the examples of early claims of fake news. There's an incident in the movie where the Drudge Report, which is a right-wing news site, tries to claim that our story was fake news. So we were early victims of this ideological attack on real reporting. And my feeling is that some of what we find is happening now has its origins in the Iraq War. That journalists were being fed information by governments which they were putting straight into the newspaper. They weren't doing their jobs properly. So we as journalists have a certain amount of collective responsibility for the way things have gone. The public was lied to. The public was let down by its major institutions, parliaments, diplomatic services, its governments, and to a certain extent by the media. So sometimes I think we have ourselves to blame. But at the same time, I feel that for my colleagues now, life is much more difficult because they are so much more directly under attack by people in power. What's the answer? I think that ultimately, in the end, journalists just have to, and this may sound too optimistic, just have to keep on keeping on. They just have to keep chipping away. You're not always going to get that massive story. But if you just keep telling the truth and getting the story out there, I can only hope that in the end, the bigger truth will be revealed.
It's only been 16 years since it all happened. But do you think the times have changed for whistleblowers, for good or for worse?
Yes, I think things have changed for whistleblowers. In this case, in the case of the story around official secrets, it was very difficult. We were under an enormous amount of pressure, but we as journalists were not targeted. And Katharine Gun, as a whistleblower, was not targeted by the authorities. And what worries me now is that precedents that started, I think, probably with the Russian government, who did target journalists, have spread wider. When we were working in 2003, we felt we were pretty much untouchable. And that's really changed. But on the positive side, much as we're suspicious of new technology, I can only hope that the isolation that whistleblowers have felt over the years, perhaps new technology can help bring whistleblowers together. It's already the case that Katharine Gun is part of an international network of whistleblowers, particularly focused on post-9/11, post-Iraq War whistleblowers. And that's a new phenomenon. Whistleblowers used to be very isolated and now they're networked. My feeling is that in the future, if we can get the technology right, we may be able to develop whistleblowing technology that means that, for instance, women who are harassed in Me Too type situations can be brought together to bring prosecutions. But I'm always an optimist.
That's good to hear. So have you been in contact with Katharine Gunn since the incident?
We've always been in contact. We didn't know each other at the time. We're very different characters. She was taught to be very suspicious of journalists, and at the very beginning of our professional relationship, I think she was extremely suspicious. But we've subsequently been thrown together by this story, and we've become friends, and in the making of this film, in its various different versions, and now in this final fantastic version, we've always made sure that all the decisions we've made together. So yes, it's become a great friendship.
That's good to hear. Let's have a look into the future. How can we make sure that, let's say, 10 years from now, we still have an investigative journalism?
I think that's one of the most important questions that can be raised about this movie. How do we, in a world where the financial models of newspapers are constantly under attack, how do we reinvent investigative journalism to make sure that it survives? We do need resources. Investigative journalism needs resources, and investigative journalists need protection. They need to be sure that the publications they're working for will back them. You cannot work on a story like the Official Secrets story if you think that maybe your editor will move away from you, or if your editor doesn't have your back. And I knew all the time when I was working at The Observer that my editor would be there for me. We had huge rows and big differences, and we didn't agree about all sorts of things, but I knew that if we ended up in a court case or we ended up in a battle with government, that he and the newspaper would be there for me. I'm not sure that's always the case now. I think journalists feel a lot more isolated because newspapers are not as strong as they were. Media organisations are not as strong as they were. The model is shifting and moving. But my feeling is that in the same way that there will always be a need for a human need for gossip, which feeds one end of the media, there will always be a human need to hold those in power to account, which expresses itself in investigative journalism. It's probably for journalists younger than myself to find a way of developing the models that allow us to do that.
I so hope that you are right on this. What are you actually working on? What are you doing right now? Besides talking about the film.
Yeah, a lot of my time is spent talking about Official Secrets at the moment, but I still work as a freelance journalist, but in 2008 I set up my own small NGO which helps young people from disadvantaged backgrounds break into the creative industries, so into the media, into the film business, into the arts, theatre, dance. Because when the crash happened in 2008, I felt that there was going to be a lost generation of young people. And I had been unemployed myself in the 1980s, and I knew what it felt like. And I felt that I had to do something. I'd spent many, many years as a journalist telling people what to do. And it's great, as a journalist you always know best. And I felt the time had come for me to try and make a difference in the real world.
That sounds amazing. Thank you very much for your time.
It's a pleasure.
Good luck with the film.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.